Welcome everyone to the Spiritual Brewpub. I'm your host Michael Camp, and today got my good friend Daniel Henderson on the podcast, and we're going to talk about his new book. I'm really excited about it. The new book is called, Dan, give us the title of your new book.
It's kind of long, Michael, and thanks for having me. The title is The Spiritual Journey to Anti-Racism, a Travel Guide for White People.
That's it. That was the part I forgot. A travel guide for white people.
Yeah.
So, Dan, you and I met last year in Nashville at a conference that our publishers put on called Awaken, and that was a great time to meet you and many other people in the ex-evangelical world. And then you were talking about this book back then. So this has been in your mind for a while, huh?
Yeah, I think that was back in, I think it was
June,
May or June of last year.
2023, yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I had the kernel of this book in my mind prior to that, and you heard about it in Nashville. But I sat down about July or August last year, and I said, I'm just gonna write this book and put it out there. And it took me about 3 to 4 months. And because I already knew what the journey to anti-racism looked like for me.
Right.
So it was the idea of how do I get this down on paper for other people to read about or to look at and think about taking a similar journey. So
right.
It came together really fast.
Yeah, right. It did. So, but you had another book, your other book that you were showcasing, Confessions of a Recovering Evangelical, which I really loved. And I think we are on similar paths. We've deconstructed evangelical theology, start to rethink a whole host of things and doctrines, and landed in similar places. But you know, your journey out of evangelicalism, I think, was a long one, right? You said it wasn't like a short, it took a while for you. You were an educator, right? That's your background.
Yes, I was an evangelical Christian. I came to, quote, born again experience in the 1960s at a Billy Graham crusade, which was really important to me. I was a young kid.
Right.
But from that point on, for the next 40 years almost, I was in conservative churches, evangelical churches. I taught in Christian schools. I went to seminary, and my life was devoted to that I'll call it an ideology now, but
right.
Coming out of that, when you leave behind 30, 40 years of what you've believed and have been committed to, it's not an easy thing. So it took me a while to really come to terms with the fact that, you know what, I'm not really an evangelical anymore. And it dawned on me in one day in about 2005, 2006, maybe.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And from then on, I had journaled about it because the way I process these kinds of changes and transitions is through journaling. And eventually that evolved into the book that you mentioned, Confessions of a Recovering Evangelical.
Right. Yeah, no, I remember you telling that story. It is true. It takes some time to unravel from that whole thing, but it's a very rewarding experience, although it's sometimes very difficult as well. So, so anyways, my first question is, you come out of evangelicalism and you share your journey about that, and then all of a sudden you switch gears and you're talking about anti-racism, So, why did you see the need to write this book?
Well, there are several reasons for that, Michael. And so coming out of evangelical, so let me answer that directly. All of my years within evangelical Christianity, I call it kind of a veil. There was a veil over my understanding of racism. And the veil went something like this. Racism is an individual sin. I mentioned I went forward at a Billy Graham crusade. Billy Graham was very clear that he was against racism, unequivocal.
Yeah.
But he said it's an individual sin.
Right.
And so you have the only way through it or around it is through repentance and coming to Jesus and being born again. Okay. Well, and I did all that until I realized that a whole bunch of people that I knew who were born again were still racist.
I see.
I mean, and in the
Wasn't
book,
working. Right.
yeah, in the book, I recount several experiences. Every chapter has a personal experience from my life dealing with racial issues and how that was processing through my mind at the time. And one of them was about a guy who was a evangelical leader in the town where I lived at the time, and he was well known. But he privately he told me a joke, and it was a racist joke with the N-word in it at the end.
Oh my gosh! Right.
And I thought, my God, this guy's born again. How could he tell me a joke like that? And he just laughed. He just barrel laughed over it.
Right.
So I began to realize being born again doesn't mean that you're going to become anti-racist. Okay, so that's one thing, Michael. And then once I shed or came out of the evangelical mindset, it began to open my whole world to a new way of thinking about racial relations. And I might add LGBTQ and all those people who are marginalized, because the church, the evangelical church at least, didn't give me permission to think about those people as really special and in God's image, right?
Yeah.
And so I marginalized them within my own thinking as an evangelical. And sometimes I did things that I write about in the book that are just, they were horrible things that I said or did, to people like that. So anyway, that's one of the reasons why this is important to me at this point. But there are a couple of others now that are really critical. And I'll go back to 2016. For all those years that I was evangelical and I still consider myself a quote non-racist. I wouldn't have said anything to anybody about their race. It just didn't seem right. But and because of that, I also realized or understood that the white supremacists are people who are on the margins. They're awful people. They're just terrible people who are on the margins, and they're kind of under a rock somewhere. And we don't have to pay a lot of attention to them. They're just awful people, and they need to repent, by the way.
Right.
We got to get these people to Jesus, right?
Yes.
But in 2016, with the advent of, and I'm just going to call it MAGA-ism and Donald Trump's ideology, these people came out of the margins and into the mainstream in a way that I had never seen it. And you and I probably both lived through the civil rights movement. So we saw things and heard things that were horrible. The N-word was typical. It was normalized in our younger years, probably. But these people came out of the margins and into the mainstream, and they became part of the Republican Party. All right. I realized then that there's something bigger here than just some racism. And then in 2020 with George Floyd, and I looked at that, everyone was horrified, of course. I realized, oh my God, there's something bigger here than just a few racists over here at the margins. It's not at the margins. It's in here.
Right.
It's in every white person. So coming out of evangelicalism and confronting those realities kind of brought me to the point where I realized, you know what? It's not about pointing my finger at other people and saying, hey, you're a racist. It's saying, what is it about white supremacy that has impacted my life individually? And what do I need to do about it now? Because the only change that can come is when people come to terms with the white supremacy that we all have been imprinted with.
Right.
So I don't know if you want me to go further with that. If you got another
Well, I
question.
mean, my next question was similar to that. It's like, what do you hope to accomplish with this book? And it seems like
Okay.
you're getting to some points on that.
Yeah. So here's the main premise of the book. The main premise of the book is, if you were born as a white person in America, you were given, without your permission, a script imprinted upon your brain or your heart, whatever you want to call it. And it's a white supremacist script. It's called it, and it comes to you through socialization from the time you're born. You're not born that way. No one's born to be racist, right? You learn it. And
Right.
but in America, the culture and the socialization process we all go through, particularly as white people, teaches us that that white supremacy is part of the background, the wallpaper, if you will, that dictates how we think, how we live, and what we and the expectations we have. So that white supremacist script is imprinted, and we don't know it because it hides.
Right. It's unconscious. Yeah.
It's unconscious. It hides in plain sight, though. I mean,
Yeah.
it's in front of you if you want to take time to look for it.
Right.
Well, that's what I began to realize about my own life in coming to terms with racial issues post evangelicalism. That not only was it an individual issue of the white supremacist script that I'm dealing with, but it also has implications for systemic issues. That is, issues that in our society, laws and systems that are set up to benefit white supremacy. And so one of the issues I deal with in the book, Michael, is where does the concept of whiteness come from?
Right. Right.
Because whiteness is not a race. And for a lot of people, it's like, really? What do you mean? Whiteness is an ideology. And it was actually created. It was at a certain point of time in our history where white people decided we need to divide blacks from whites early in colonial America so that white people won't find common cause with black people and endanger wealthy white planters,
Right.
by joining together. And there's a whole chapter on that in the book.
Yeah.
So,
I was interested in that. I mean, one question I have is you talk about race-based slavery
yeah.
began in America, and I think those historical kind of facts and parts of what you bring out in your book really help people understand, like the things you're saying, the concept of race. Where did it come from? Where did our mentality and racism against colored people come from? And so, why don't you answer that question? What do you mean by saying race-based slavery began in America?
Okay, so the other background people might want to know is I've been a teacher of American history for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So teaching about Black American history has been something I've been involved in for almost my whole professional life. But when I say that racism, as we think of it today, being race-based, is something new. Slavery is not new in history. So, I mean, all through history, we find civilizations that have had slavery. That's not anything.
And it wasn't just blacks being enslaved. It was
But
white.
it wasn't based on skin color. It was based on economics.
Right.
It was based on warfare. If we conquered you, then you get to be our slaves. But there was always the opportunity, even in those situations, for the slaves to earn freedom. They could marry within the dominant population and come out of it, or maybe they would earn enough money on the side to, gain freedom. It was only in the British colonies around the year, in the mid 1600s, that really rich white planters discovered that and there are a lot of economic reasons for this, but they discovered that we can't let the lower class white people who were known as indentured servants. There were a lot of indentured servants in America
right.
who were white.
Were white, right.
And some of the first black enslaved people were also indentured servants. There wasn't that much difference between the two. They worked together in the fields, and they were treated sometimes about as badly, each way. But they came together in an event, and we'll read about it in the book, called Bacon's Rebellion. So if you're a history buff, go back and read Bacon's Rebellion, because in that rebellion, 1670s, early 70s, white indentured servants and black indentured servants and black enslaved people joined together to rise up. And the planners realized, hey, you know what? Those guys outnumber us by a whole lot. We've got to set up a system so that the white indentured servants don't feel an affinity with the black indentured servants.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right.
So here's what they did. They passed a series of laws in Virginia. This kind of happened in Virginia originally. That said, look, if you're white, you still have some privileges. Here they are. You get to own property. You get to you can testify in court. You can have your marriages recognized, by the clergy. If you're black, you don't get those things.
You mean the indentured servants?
Yeah, the indentured servants, or even the enslaved people, because there were several.
Right. Yeah.
But so what it did, and the biggest one was they allowed the lower class whites within society to join the slave patrols.
Mm-hmm.
So they gave them some authority and a badge and a horse, and said, you go out and round up any of the runaway slaves, so that you get a reward for that, right? So it was a way of creating a distance between whites and blacks that became seared into the American psyche.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's a hierarchy.
It's a hierarchy. Why would you create whiteness if there were no benefits to you in terms of hierarchy?
Right.
There's no point to it. So the concept of race-based slavery, going back to your question, is based on the idea of creating a system of benefits and privileges that white people have that black people don't, so that you can divide the two. You can separate.
Right.
Okay. Well, and that evolved over time. It evolved into what we see in the 18th century, or 19th century rather, with slavery in the South. It just got worse and worse. But here's the deal, Michael. Even after the Civil War, the concept of white supremacy never went away. Slavery did. But white supremacy didn't. And it's still with us. It still is imprinted upon, and I would suggest, every white person in the United States.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree with you that, I mean, I'll tell you in a moment, I'll tell you about an experience I had in Africa that kind of illustrates that. But
Great. Well, what I was going to say is that the book is about coming to terms as a white person with that white supremacist script.
Yeah.
And how do we and I contend it's a spiritual journey. It's not something that is just strictly cognitive. You really got to wrestle with that on a emotional, psychological level that brings you to terms with the fact that, oh, I have these attitudes. I have these beliefs that I didn't even realize I had.
Right.
That's what an anti-racist is, Michael. Someone who has come to terms with those unconscious beliefs and biases and says, oh my God, I see it now. And here's the thing. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't unlearn it. So the book is about helping white people, going back to your original question, helping white people come to terms with that white supremacist script.
Yeah.
And learning how to rewrite the script. How do we rewrite it?
So you called that epiphany that you get, you become anti-racist. So what is the difference between that and someone who just says, I'm not racist, and a
It's a good
non-racist? What are the
Yeah.
differences?
Every religious evangelical person I know has told me they're not racist.
Right.
But that isn't the same as being anti-racist.
Right.
And here's the difference, Michael. Someone who says I'm non-racist is trying to avoid guilt. And I've had to come to terms with that. I mean, when you look at, and this is where history plays a part, when you look at the history of how white people have treated black people and indigenous people, Hispanic people, it goes on and on. It is horrific. It is a system of human trafficking and genocide that is unparalleled in history. And that's why they don't want to teach this. That's why they don't want it taught, because it is unparalleled in human history, how badly it's happened. It's worse than the Holocaust in many ways in Germany. All right. So coming to terms with being non-racist means the issue is I don't want to be, since they're coming from this from an individualistic point of view, they don't want to be called racist because they never owned slaves. They've never hurt anybody.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's not what black people want from white people, is a sense of guilt. No one has ever asked white people to feel guilty for the sins of the past.
Right.
So within the book, I kind of pivot about halfway through, and I kind of deal with the guilt issue, because there is a sense of guilt that we have to deal with, and I call it complicit guilt, or the sin of omission. Within Christianity, there's a whole concept of the sin of omission, not doing the right thing that you should do, right?
Right.
In the face of injustice.
Right.
And a lot of us are probably guilty of that. All right. So we need to come to terms with what I call good guilt. But then we have to pivot that, kind of have a reckoning with it, but then pivot into what I would say is the most important motive for anti-racism, which is empathy. So I don't want to become an anti-racist because I feel guilty. And black people don't want you to become an anti-racist because you feel guilty. Because here's what happens. If I become an anti-racist because I feel guilty, then my feelings are at the center. My feelings are paramount.
Right.
It isn't black people that I'm worried about. It's me.
Yes. Right. Exactly. That makes
it's the same. It's the same. See, white supremacy hates to not be at the center. And so coming to anti-racism by way of empathy means I have to put myself in the shoes of people of color.
Yes, right.
Because, Michael, you and I, white guys, right, we have never experienced discrimination in the way that black people or indigenous people have. Never, not one time, ever. We've had privileges that we aren't even aware of all of our lives. And a lot of white people don't want to admit that, but they have. and a lot of that comes from things that haven't happened to us because we're white.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
You don't notice them because, whatever it is, you got that mortgage, that you applied for, and you don't realize that, blacks they have twice or three times it's hard for them to get a mortgage or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So I wanted to bring up this example in Africa. When I lived in Africa off and on for 7 years, and it was quite an experience. But that unfortunately, even among African peoples, they had that sense of white privilege because they came from a colonial power that kind of took over. And when they in East Africa, they call white people the Azungus. Okay, so when the Azungus show up, people will just treat you like you're higher than them, right?
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Yeah, and so I recognized that we didn't want them to do that, but that it was just there, and so you kind of had to deal with that. And then the other thing you realize that people treated us very nicely. We were, just because of our skin color, right? Now, and also if you were black from America, maybe, they wouldn't put you on that level, because they just were buying into white supremacy, except for people who realized what was going on, But I remember one time that it hit me when you talk about empathy, right? What is it like to be black? What is it like to live and be black, right? And when you live in the States, it's almost always the majority of the people are white, and then minorities are black and other ethnic groups. But in Africa, it's flipped. So if you live there for a long time, you're the minority, and as far as skin color goes, right? And black people are the majority. And there comes a time when you start to realize, you know what? White people, now I'm looking at them differently, not because of necessarily of hierarchy or anything, but I'm just saying they look kind of pale and sickly. I see the beauty in black people now. I see, I start to notice things I didn't notice before. I see the culture, even in black communities in the U.S. Sometimes there's a different culture. You see that culture and you go, oh, that's a different culture, and I appreciate that culture. Things like that. So it helps you open your eyes to things that you just don't notice.
Well, and you kind of put away the idea that white culture is better than another.
Yeah, right. Then you start to realize, wait a minute, we are really equal. We are truly equal.
Yeah.
And it's a new paradigm shift. That can be very refreshing, but also a little bit, like, whoa, I didn't notice this. How come I didn't notice this?
How many years did you spend in Africa, Michael?
7 years altogether. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, you weren't just there for a mission trip.
No. I lived in Somalia
you were there
for 2 years. I lived in Kenya a few months, in Somalia 2 years. I lived in Malawi for 5 years.
Yeah.
So we got really entrenched, and it was just, and the appreciation of cultures was really one of the biggest things, because I would come back to the American culture and start being critical of American culture, because, like, wow, we do a lot of weird things, right? So you start to see the differences, and then you realize, you know what? Human beings are the same. They just have different cultures and ways of thinking. You got to start thinking about all human beings are equal,
Because all human beings know how to love.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't matter what your skin color is.
Right.
So
I wanted to look at a little bit more of some examples of white privilege. I kind of hinted at one with that mortgage example. What are some of the things that like black people experience in their life that we don't experience? What's going on there?
Well, in the book, I talk about white privilege as being sort of a benefit of the doubt. So as a white kid growing up in Iowa, here I'm in a state where it's less than 4% black population.
Oh, really?
It's a higher Hispanic population now.
Yeah,
but it's still less than 4% black population. But growing up in Iowa, I had the benefit of the doubt. So as a white kid, so let me tell you what that means, or what it meant for me. It meant that if I was out late at night walking around the streets of my town, no one stopped me ever.
Yes. Right.
And questioned me why I was there.
Right.
Okay. Now, if it were a black kid walking those streets, dark at night, kind of like Trayvon Martin, right? Yeah. Why are you here? You look suspicious to me. Why? Right. Because you're black. And that's just not the norm. See, white supremacy teaches us that white is the norm. It's
Mhm.
it's the baseline,
Right.
and it's not to be questioned. It's not to be suspected of anything, right? If you're white, you must have the best of intentions about everything, right? Because
Right.
you're
Yeah.
white. See?
Right.
So no one ever questioned me run around my neighborhood at night because I was white. Here's the other thing. No one ever questioned me if I had a nice car.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
when I went to college, I could get a car, and I had a decent car. I wouldn't call it nice, but a decent car. The police never stopped me. Now I have a former coworker who was black, who went to a college. I won't say where, but he had a nice car because actually his family had enough money that they could provide him a decent car. In the first 2 years in that town where he didn't grow up there, he was stopped 45 times.
Really? And how long of a period of
45
time?
times in 2 years.
Oh, wow. 45.
Because they searched his car for drugs.
Oh my
Okay.
gosh. Yeah.
So the benefit of the doubt for me
Right.
was I'm a white guy. I can drive a nice car. No one's going to stop me and look for drugs.
Right.
But if you're black and you got a decent car, the assumption is that you must be dealing drugs. So we got to stop you and search your car. Now, here's the other one, the benefit of the doubt. And this happened in my hometown here in Iowa. This was a true story. Friend of mine, black person, goes to Walmart, and almost every other time they go to Walmart and they leave, they get stopped by a clerk who says, "Show me your receipt."
Right.
Because the assumption is because they have black skin, they probably shoplifted something.
Yes. Right.
Right. Now, me, I go to Walmart in my town. I don't even take the receipt. I don't worry about the receipt.
You've probably never been accused of shoplifting your whole
No
life.
one has ever accused me of shoplifting because I'm a white guy.
Right.
And so this isn't anti-white. It's simply saying the benefit of the doubt always goes to the white person every time. And so those are maybe small things. Oh, here's another one. I had another coworker, benefit of the doubt, right? Mm-hmm. I go take walks through my neighborhood at night, just strolling through, and I meet people and talk to them. This guy I worked with, professional man, has advanced degrees, black man, lives in a middle-class neighborhood. He cannot go for walks at night on his own unless he takes his little daughter with him.
Yeah.
Because someone will look out their window and see him out there, and they'll call the police, and they'll wonder why is this black guy in our neighborhood?
Right. Yeah.
And the only justification he can provide is, well, I'm taking my daughter for a walk. We live just, a few houses down. Those are benefits of the doubt. We don't think about it as white people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And most white people, if you say you've got white privilege, they'll say, "Oh no one ever gave me any heads up or handouts." That's what they think. That's what they think white privilege is a handout. It's not a handout. It's a benefit of the doubt.
Oh yes, right.
That because you're white, you're not guilty of anything.
Right.
But if you're black, we suspect you, and we're going to call the police. Right.
No, that's true. I mean, you can see examples of that even today when you hear some of these stories about people getting arrested or killed or shot in neighborhoods or whatever, and
happens constantly.
Right.
Yeah.
Constantly.
Yeah.
And like you said, I mean, and I think probably today, I think we're more in tune to it, so it gets more press, and we, people who care about equality will write about it and speak about it in the press. But there was a day when it wouldn't even make the papers, or it was nothing. It was like So, so what about okay, race-based slavery began in America. We started to develop a hierarchy with whites and blacks for economic reasons, the foundation of white supremacy. And what about the church? How was the church complicit in this? What were they doing when this was going on?
Well, ironically, the construction of whiteness began in the 1660s, 1670s, 1680s, and so on. It was at that moment in time, because there was a law. There was what was called English common law. And English common law at that time, or prior to when they changed it, said, if you're a Christian, you cannot be enslaved.
Okay.
It goes back to the doctrine of discovery, which is even earlier, 1500s, 1400s.
Mm-hmm.
Don't need to go into that. But if the church, whether you're talking about the Anglican Church or the Puritans or the Baptists, whoever in the colonies, because there was a diversity of religions,
right.
If they had said, we aren't changing that. If a black person is Christian,
mm-hmm.
they cannot be enslaved.
Right.
I talk about a story in the book about a woman named Elizabeth Key.
Mm-hmm.
And it was her story that actually kind of prompted this change, because her father, she was actually biracial. She was born of an African woman and a white man in the 1630s, right
mm-hmm.
after the colonies were established. She was an indentured servant, but her father was white, and her father had her baptized in the church.
Okay.
She was a Christian, and so she sued for her freedom after, there's a long story there.
But after, based on a common law, right?
Based on common law, she should
right.
not have been enslaved. And you know what? She won her suit. She was freed because her defense was, I'm a Christian. I've been baptized. My father is white, which was English common law. And the court in Virginia said, well, that's English common law. We can't argue with that. Guess what they did after that case, Michael?
They changed the law.
They changed the law. And if the church had stood up and said, no, we are not changing the law so that you can enslave black people, even when they're Christians, that might have helped, right? Yeah. But they didn't do that. Michael, they were complicit in that.
Yeah.
And for the next 150 years, as slavery evolved, the church, particularly in the South, developed theological reasons why black people should be enslaved. Not just it's okay to do it. It's here's the reasons why in the Bible it's okay to enslave back, the story of Cain and all those nonsense theological reasons. So the church, through that period, was very complicit. They allowed it to happen. They didn't stop it. Then after the Civil War and in the Jim Crow era, the church really didn't change much. What they did is they developed theological reasons why segregation was God's will. So that went on for
that kind of begs the question. I've always wondered about this because, the abolitionists rose up, and from what I've read, a lot of them were Christians that were, recognizing the injustice of the system. But did they, like even Abraham Lincoln, didn't he want to just send black people to Africa? I mean,
that was his original plan.
Yeah, right. So I'm wondering if this was kind of like a moral, a moral development for people. Okay, I'm an abolitionist, but now that we've gotten rid of slavery, how did they view blacks? Were they completely looking at blacks to be equal citizens and human beings, or was there some mixed feelings in there?
Well, there were two groups in American religious history that probably got close to being right about it. And one was the Quakers.
The Quakers, right.
Yep. The Quakers were the first abolitionists, and they had a what I would call a true principle of equality, even between men and women. They didn't have this patriarchy, and that's important to understand, Michael, that patriarchy and racism are two sides of the same coin.
Oh, right. Yeah, right.
So if you're going to promote patriarchy, that is, men should be in control and women are subservient, it
Hmm.
is a very short step to saying white people are superior to black people too,
Exactly. Right.
because it enhances the position of white males every
Yeah.
time.
Right.
Okay, but the Quakers and the Mennonites were another group that really were truly abolitionists
Hmm.
for what I would call theological reasons. They looked at the Bible and they said, oh my gosh, we can't find anything in the Bible that says white people should be superior to black people. We're all
Right.
the same.
Yeah.
Now, they were a minority, and obviously their voice was drowned out, but they were there, and I think that's really important to recognize, so we don't group all Christians in the
Exactly.
same
But
line.
still, the point you were making before was once they abolished slavery, I guess there were a few years of Reconstruction that
Right.
some people were trying to bring equality, and
Yeah.
then all of a sudden, I forgot what year it was, in the 1870s or 80s.
1877.
Yeah, it ended, and now it was back to, okay, we can't enslave blacks, but we're going to treat them unequally.
Yeah.
We're going to keep our hierarchy, and Jim Crow laws evolved.
Yeah, and a lot of the justification for that came from evangelical preachers who said that segregation was God's will.
Right.
They brought in all kinds of, verses to, for textual, out of context kinds of rationalizations for that. But that lasted. I mean, and quite frankly, Michael, you'll still find people today that believe that. I mean, it's not anything that's gone away entirely. But that certainly was true up through the 1960s. And then he hit the 1960s with the civil rights movement, which you and I might remember. And I remember it well. And I write about it in the book several places where, as a kid growing up, trying to come to terms, because, the N-word, I don't know if it was true for you, but the N-word was common as I was growing up. Everybody used that, white people anyway, used that term. They made jokes. And so there's that white supremacist script that is still there that says white is better than black, and you better be glad you're not black,
No, yeah, that's true. I mean, I think it was more prominent in the South. I grew up in the North, but you could still see racism and discrimination. But I remember watching the movie To Sir with Love. Do you remember that movie?
Oh yeah, sure. That was a great movie.
Portier. I mean, he was such a great example. That movie struck me as like, wow, this guy is, he's so smart, and it was like that. Those kinds of, there were glimpses of things in our culture that showed, yes, blacks are equal. Everyone's equal. And that movie would be a good example. A lot of the civil rights leaders, of course, are a good example and everything. But there was this underlying racism that was always there. And as your book really brings out, there was the benefit of the doubt that most white people did not notice because they were blind to it.
Yeah,
so
and
very fascinating.
And that attitude, that belief, is just kind of handed down from generation to generation. Now, it takes different forms depending on the social context or the political context. So after the 60s, and black people were, at least politically, enfranchised and given full citizenship and certain rights. But white supremacy began to evolve. It doesn't go away, Michael. It just evolves.
Right. It morphs into something else.
Yeah. And so you see it emerge again in the 1980s with colorblind politics, colorblind theology, and people who they have coded language. That's why you don't hear the N-word so much anymore, but you do hear coded words.
Right. Yeah.
that people use. Lazy, thug,
Yeah.
everything except the N word, because that's just not acceptable anymore.
Right. Right.
But
So, yeah, go ahead. Finish your thought.
oh, that's fine.
Well, I was going to say, I really love history, and you're a history teacher. Well, why is it important to learn Black history and historical highlights of Black people? Why do you think that's important for us?
So I include in the book 2 chapters on. There's actually 3 chapters on developing empathy as a motivation to become anti-racist. And I share, at least in two of those chapters, it's about my experience in both learning about and teaching about Black history and visiting Black historic sites that have allowed me to put myself in the shoes of Black people.
Yes, right.
Because I think until you do that, you can study history from a completely cognitive, intellectual point of view, which is fine, and there's a place for that. But if we're striving to become anti-racist, I think history becomes a vehicle for us to put ourselves in the shoes of other people. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of examples. The lynchings that took place in the Jim Crow era,
Right,
which are highly documented, over 4,000 of them are documented. There are pictures, sometimes videos, written accounts, newspaper accounts of these horrific events taking place against Black people in the South. And that's not just in the South, by the way. I grew up in Iowa near Omaha, Council Bluffs, Iowa, right across the river was Omaha. In 1920, I think it was 1921, a guy by the name of Willie Brown was lynched in Omaha, Nebraska, right in the downtown area.
Wow. Yeah.
Right across from where I wasn't alive at the time, but the point is, it happened everywhere. It happened in Duluth, Minnesota. There were lynchings of 4 Black people in downtown Duluth, Minnesota. Okay, we think of that as being.
Can't get much farther north than that.
Yeah. So it wasn't just the South, and that's one of the myths, by the way, that we have to kind of unravel.
Right.
Oh, it's those awful Southerners. Oh, no, it's not. We all have a white supremacist script up here that we have to undo and come to terms with. So anyway, the historic sites, I've been to places like the Tulsa Massacre. I went down to Tulsa a couple of years ago, and just walked those streets where that horrific event took place and tried to understand, what did it feel like to be on the recipient end of that massacre. I went to a place called Whitney Plantation down in Louisiana several years ago. And that plantation isn't a tribute to the white people that live there. It's a tribute and a historic monument to the enslaved people that lived there.
Oh, right. Okay.
And so as you walk through the plantation, you're going into the slave cabins. You're going into the prison that they used to lock up unruly slaves. You're going through the sugarcane fields where they worked 16-hour days, and the average lifespan of a male slave was 7 years.
Oh my gosh!
Because it was so cheap to replace them. They could replace them.
You mean once they got enslaved, they only lived 7
they
years?
work on a sugar. Now this is a sugar plantation, not a cotton plantation. They were different. Sugar plantations were much more labor intense for certain times of the year, but they worked them to death. They literally worked them to death because they could get another one so cheap.
A fresh one, right?
Yeah, they bring him in. This guy died. We'll get another one. Right?
Oh gosh.
So having empathy with that experience, I think, is important. But there's another side to the empathy. And it's the courage
Mhm.
and the courageous struggle that Black people and Indigenous people and all the other groups of people have exerted on their own behalf, their own agency,
Yeah.
through civil rights, through fighting back, through standing up to it. You know what? That's if I can come into contact with that, that's a huge piece of empathy that gives me hope, and I can learn from that how to stand up against injustice.
Right. Right. It's true. So I
So,
want. Oh, go ahead.
well, what I was going to say is those 3 chapters about empathy are critical. They're kind of like the
Yeah.
core of the book, because what I'm trying to get white people to understand, it's not about guilt. Every time you talk to somebody who's white about racism, their first response is, well, I didn't do it.
Yeah.
I'm not guilty. It's not about your guilt, my friend. It's about your complicity in a system today that still marginalizes people of color.
Yeah. And
You didn't hold slaves, and no one's saying that. And it's about becoming empathetic
yeah.
toward that plight.
Yeah. That's very critical. It's about
Yeah,
becoming
yeah,
empathetic and imagining and experiencing what it was like to be in their shoes. And you bring up a great point. This learning Black history, going to historical sites helps you develop that empathy because you learn things you don't know. I mean, I'll just give
that's
you an
right.
example. Um, when I was in
Oh, yeah.
Maryland last summer visiting a friend on the Eastern Shore, I went to the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Museum.
What a wonderful experience.
And then, this was part of it, National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom.
Yeah.
I went to that museum and I was blown away. First of all, I didn't realize Frederick Douglass was a slave there on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. When I was a kid, I would go down and visit my friend who lived in an old plantation house that was probably a slave house,
Yeah.
a slave owner's house. And, back in the day, and we didn't know what was going on. And now you go back and you learn, oh, wait a minute, right where we were, right where, we spent our summers, that's where Harriet Tubman was a slave, Frederick Douglass was a slave, and the Underground Railroad was started there, or at least part of it was.
And the heroic nature of Harriet Tubman and people like that who risked their lives.
Oh, amazing.
To bring others into freedom.
Right.
I mean, that's empathy. If you can connect to that. See, that's
connect to it. And read Frederick Douglass's book too. I mean, that's a powerful book. I can't remember the title, but so let's pivot a little bit, because you have this concept that you called the road to reckoning for the white community. What can people do? We're talking about some things, but what is the road to reckoning for folks that need to really delve into this more and pursue anti-racism?
Well, the road to reckoning is, there are several parts to it, I think. One of them is separating out what is bad guilt from good guilt. Okay, so bad guilt, which is what most white people think of when you bring up the concept of racism, is the feeling of, I'm guilty because of all the bad things that people did in the past.
Yeah.
Right. No one wants white people to feel guilty today if they're not guilty. It's the guilt of commission. If you commit a sin against someone, then you're guilty. But if you didn't, then you're not guilty. Okay, so that's bad guilt. But that's what most white people think about when the topic comes up. They think, oh, you're just trying to make me feel guilty for things that other people did.
Yeah.
Not about that. It's about the sin of omission. The sin of omission is all of this stuff is still going on. We have horrible inequities. We have killings of Black people in the street yet today that are still going on, that if I'm not speaking out against it, then you know what? I'm complicit. It's the sin of omission. I'm not doing anything about it. Okay.
Right.
That's the good guilt. All right. So that's one part of the reckoning, is separating good guilt from bad guilt. Next part of it is just simply recognize that for myself, for every white person, we have had this script imprinted upon our minds our whole lives without our consent. No, no one asked you and me, Michael, if we want to be white supremacists.
Right.
No one said, hey, here's this way of thinking. Do you want this? It was just there. It was given to us. It was imprinted upon us from the day we were born because of the way we were socialized. So part of that reckoning is having kind of coming to awareness of that. Oh, yeah, I've got this way of thinking that I didn't ask for, but it's there. And I'll tell you what, the evidence, the scientific evidence would prove that white people, there's a whole bunch of evidence around. I don't have time to go into it. But so coming to the awareness that we have this script, and then determining, I want to rewrite that script. That's the reckoning right there. I am going to use my agency and my power of decision to rewrite the script in my own heart and my own head to do away with that white supremacy. And then there's another part to it. Because here's the thing. I would love to suggest to people that we can do this in one generation.
Mm-hmm.
We can't, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take a multi-generational approach. So part of the reckoning is, how do I raise not anti-racist kids, anti-racist grandkids, and if I'm around long enough, anti-racist great-grandchildren?
Yeah, right.
How do I do that? What example do I set? How do I teach them? So reckoning is, so it comes down ultimately to a daily walk, a daily process of being aware of the white supremacist script that I have, and that I'm trying to rewrite it now. I'm trying to undo it, and I'm trying to create a next generation that maybe has a little easier time of doing that, and then the next generation, right? That's how we create a society that might be free one day of white supremacist.
Yeah. So having that paradigm shift and making a proactive approach to it, but also fighting for laws that do bring equality and and promoting Black history that we can learn, empathy, etc., and fighting injustices.
Yeah. And that's actually getting into the definition of anti-racism, because anti-racism is so different than just saying, oh, I'm not a racist.
Right.
It's saying, I understand what the script is that I've been living by. Mm-hmm. And so I'm ready now to take action. See, anti-racism is all about taking action. It's a verb. It's saying, here's what I intend to do to undo the unjust systems that still exist, because they're out there. Right. We can see it because of the inequities that still exist. So now anti-racism will look very different for different people because of whatever skills and expertise and interests they have. So for me, it's about teaching, right? Yeah, right. Yeah. My anti-racism is about teaching true American history, which includes Black history. It's not an add-on. It's just Black history is part of American history. Right. And helping my kids and grandkids understand that, and students. So, but for someone else, it might be, they're a lawyer. So they're going to advocate for ending systemic racist policies within their community or nationally even. Someone else is, whatever, a banker. We can end systemic racism in the mortgage industry. Yes. Right. If we have people who are aware of it. Right. Right. So it goes on and on. Whatever your role in life is, you can be an anti-racist. Yeah, that's good. I like that. Yeah, and utilize whatever skills and expertise you
Right.
have
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah. It's your journey, and you've got, like you said, you got skills and background and interests. You choose what resonates with you,
Right.
and or where you'll have the most impact because of your skills.
Right.
Well, we're kind of running out of time, but what I wanted to draw attention to this chart I'm looking at that I think is in your book. It's talking about inequalities, black and white inequalities, and it's a question why. And it said like home ownership rates. Blacks have a 44% home ownership rate, and whites have almost 74%. Poverty rates, blacks have 21% and whites are only 8%. Prisoners, I mean, this is crazy. Prisoners per 100,000 adults, blacks 1,500, whites only 268. Wealth per household, average wealth per household, blacks 24,000, whites 188,000. And so these are the kinds of things that we don't see because we're not doing the math. We're not looking at the statistics. We're just living our life and sometimes oftentimes just being given the benefit of the doubt and reaping some things that Black people don't always reap because of the inequalities.
Yeah, and so there's two ways to look at those statistics. If you look at those statistics through the lens of white supremacy, then the only conclusion you can come to is that the reason those inequalities exist is because of the deficiency of Black people.
Yeah, then you come up with the lazy and the thug.
Lazy, they're
criminal
thugs,
element.
their families are broken up, so they're no good, yada.
Right.
The other lens is through an anti-racist lens, which says the reason these inequalities exist is because they exist within the economic, legal, educational, financial system that we have.
Right.
And they were created a long time ago. It isn't like somebody thought these things up, yesterday.
Yeah.
Give you one example. In the New Deal, there was a thing called the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, another little history lesson. But that program, along with the GI Bill after World War II, probably were the key things that created the white middle class.
Oh,
I mean, you got to own a home, you got to go to college on a GI Bill, which meant your income went up. Here's the problem with these programs. They were great programs, but they excluded Black people.
Oh, I see. Right.
You could not, if you were Black, you could not get an FHA loan. At least most of them could.
Right.
If you were Black and you were a veteran, you still couldn't get the GI Bill.
Is that right? Wow.
And go to college.
Yeah.
So when you think about generational wealth, a lot of our families started generating that wealth a long time ago, 2, 3, 4 generations ago because of those programs. For Black people, they've only had access to that since maybe the late 1970s or 80s, when they finally said, oh, okay, we have to give Black people FHA loans. It's just, you can't discriminate. Well, think about all the generational wealth that has been lost.
Yes, right.
So the question, and it still happens. I mean, there's still discrimination within housing and those kinds of things. So anti-racism says, what can I do? If I'm a banker, what can I do to end that, change that? If I'm an educator, what can I do to bring people into awareness of that? So it's a daily routine. It's a daily awareness thing that I think white people need to assume, but it's based on empathy and compassion, not on guilt. Not on guilt. We feel guilt.
Right.
In fact, I'll tell you this: guilt will not put food on the table of a Black person.
Yeah.
But empathy and compassion and taking action will.
Yeah.
It will reduce those inequities. So that's where the book goes, Michael. I'm really happy that you've highlighted it, because I'm passionate about this.
No, I can see you are. I mean, this is great. I've read the book and I endorsed it, and I'm going to promote it even more now that it's out. And
Appreciate that.
folks, the title is The Spiritual Journey to Anti-Racism, a travel guide for white people. And it is a guide. It really does walk you through so many things, and you'll learn so many probably new things that you never knew, and open your eyes, and it'll help you, like Dan has been sharing, to find a path of action in whatever realm that you fits best with you, so that you can do something to actually be proactive and be anti-racist. So thanks, Dan, for joining us today. Appreciate it. Where can folks find the book?
Well, it's on Amazon, so all you got to do is go there and look up either the title or my name, and Daniel Henderson. You'll find it.
All right, so it's on Amazon. Do you have a website or just?
Yeah. So my website is danhendersonauthor.com. So
all right, danhendersonauthor.com. I'll put that in the show notes, as well as a link to your book.
Great. I appreciate it.
So yeah, folks, get this book. It's excellent. And thanks, Dan, for joining us. I hope we can connect another time. You're becoming prolific, so maybe your next book will be out within a year or whatever.
Well, it seems like after that first one, the next one was easier to write, and so they're coming a little bit quicker than.
Yeah, they're coming quicker, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I have a lot to say, as you might guess. So.
Oh yeah, you've got a lot of good stuff to say. I've learned so much from you. All right. Well, so folks, we're going to sign off now. Until next time, on the Spiritual Brewpub, enjoy responsibly.